Well, thank you so much, Hannah, and Kate for offering the next Zoom link. So this is a nice exercise in digital theology we are sharing here. And we have plenty of time. As I mentioned earlier, there will be only one paper in this session as Susanna had to drop out. So we are good. And Florian and I are happy to start to present something on digital public theology or public theology and digitality or public digital theology or whatever. We'll discuss that later. That's something we both of us have been thinking about for a couple of years now. And then when we get invited to write a chapter in the handbook on that issue, we try to somehow summarize whatever digital theology might be and whatever might be changing when one enters the digital publics and how that might affect public theology and digital theology alike. We prepared some slides. I can't share the slides at the moment. Kate, with you. All good. Sure. Thanks. We prepared some slides so that you could follow easily, and you're interested, like for all the sessions we have, you can read the full thing in the handbook coming up.
Hello.
So, public theology and digitality. There would have been a lot to
Hi,
say.
Steve. We can hear.
Okay. There would have been a lot to say on that intersection. So we choose to start with a short introduction into public theologies. Public theology has been a field emerging since the 1980s, and the term has been widely used in multiple contexts and by a multitude of theologians and clergy. Given its diversity, it seems advisable to speak of public theologies as opposed to one public theology. The South African theologian Dirkie Smith has given some order to the wide field of public theologies by telling 6 different stories. And you can read these in the chapter. I won't revise them now. On the one hand, these 6 stories show the diversity of topics, relevant context, and traditions that are dealt with under the headline public theology. On the other hand, it shows the commonalities of these different stories. Because in each story, public theology has somehow to do with the public or political dimension of religion. Plus, in more than one story, the urge to go public is internally linked with a critical perspective on society. Given this diversity, we have followed others in suggesting to understand public theology as a heading of a discourse. Public theology neither refers to a school of theology or specific dogmatic teachings, nor solely to a program of ecclesial transformation, but primarily to an international and intercontextual discourse in which all these issues are debated. The diverse contributions to this discourse are connected by their common focus on the public dimension of religion, Christian practice, and theology. In different public theologies, the term public qualifies theology in different ways. It can emphasize that the topics of public theology are publicly relevant, or it can distinguish that their contributions are meant to be public in a way that they have to be understandable to the public. And it can, as Tracy wrote, refer to a public discourse and the reflection of all these public dimensions. While there's a multitude of public theologies, important narratives of public theology stress its critical and transformational dimension. Public theology is not about describing the publics, but it's mostly about how to change them. On this background, we want to suggest that coming from public theologies brings a particular perspective to digital theologies, namely a critical one. In this perspective, digital theology does not merely describe or analyze the role of religion in digitally constituted public spheres. It will also entail a constructive dimension that allows this theology to be critical of digital transformations in all spheres of society, including ecclesial practices. How that could be done, we thought about as a form of a matrix, which Florian will say a few words about.
Yeah, Having to do with the intersection of public theology and digital theology, we are dealing with two discourses that are quite vast and in two discourses that lack a clear definition of what it means. Hence, we've tried to explore the intersection between these two fields by creating a matrix that makes it a little more ordered what we can talk about. We see the field of digital theology as a two-dimensional one. One axis has to do with how media and technology are understood, focusing on the digital. The other axis has to do with how the task of theology is conceptualized. Next slide. On the first axis lie understandings of media. And there we have to do with three different understandings that already Heidi Campbell and Stephen Garner have distinguished. And all three understandings still play a role in the discourse and are relevant to the discourse on digital technology. There is, first of all, an instrumental understanding of digital media that understands digital media as a mere tool, as something with which one can reach a pre-given end or goal. Next slide. And the next one too. Then we have a hermeneutical understanding of media, which takes into account the content of communication and that it is not independent of media technology. Rather, technology is seen as a factor that influences whether people communicate, what they communicate, and how they understand the world. And next one. The societal understanding of media goes further. Campbell and Garner describe such an understanding according to which media and their use is always embedded in a wider society and culture and interacts with that. So on the one axis, we have these three different kinds of understanding of media. On the other axis, we have the three different understandings of theology and of theology's publics that David Tracy has already introduced in the early 1980s. Next slide. David Tracy says that the theologian has the public of the society. So that's what theology also deals with issues of the wider society, of politics and of Christianity being embedded and being part of the wider society. Secondly, theology deals with the church and asks for how digital transformation affects the church. And thirdly, theology deals with itself as an academic endeavor. So it's about theology as an academic discourse and how digital transformation might affect this academical discourse. Given this matrix, we will now exemplify these three publics and how a public digital theology can deal with these three publics and what topics it will encounter on these topics. And when you're interested in further reading of that, you'll find a longer text on that in the chapter we wrote for the Augsburg Handbook. And in all three fields, we work critical and constructively. And one of the most important orientations we will work with is the orientation towards participation. So it's about enabling meaningful participation in these three fields. In the society, meaning participation in social or political discourse and life. In the academy, meaning participation in theological discourse and witness. And church, meaning to make participation in church life and in community life possible. So let's start with the public sphere. So with society and the public and the transformation of the public sphere in society. Inspired by the tradition of public theologies, digital theologies has to deal with the public sphere. The move from an instrumental to a hermeneutical understanding of media applies a move to see the structural transformation of the public sphere. Originally, this expression was used by Jürgen Habermas to describe the transformation of the public sphere since the 18th century, brought about by mass society, mass media, and other factors. The same term has more recently been used to highlight the transformation of the public sphere in and by digital media, particularly social media. It is highly contested what exactly this digital transformation of public spheres consists of. The following three theses show that what this transformation could be about. Next slide. Okay. And one more. And and one more. Yes. So the thesis about what this transformation looks like. The sociologian Jan Schmidt has written about personal publics, and his thesis is that in social media, a new kind of public evolves, namely a personal public, which is not public in character, but which entails a lot of information and expressions that are rather personal. With this term personal public, he shows that the line between public and private becomes fluid in digital rooms. The second thesis that's broadly discussed is from Jürgen Habermas himself, but is also out there in variations by Eli Pariser or, for example, Cass Sunstein. It's the thesis that the digital transformation of public spheres leads to a fragmentation of the public sphere into many small issue publics, into filter bubbles, or into echo chambers. Another thesis that is not agreeing with this fragmentation thesis is by Christoph Neuberg, who says that the public sphere becomes an integrated public sphere that entails smaller publics, that entails filter bubbles, but that at the same time also entails the broader, wider public constituted by something like the mass media. So he says it's an integrated public that involves both. And all these transformations now are very relevant for ethics. They are relevant for the church that understands itself as a public church, but they are also relevant for theology that might understand itself as a public theology that participates in social and public discourse. So when we now look at the three understandings of media that are, and we presuppose the orientation towards participation, it's particularly three topics that come to mind. If we understand digital media as a mere tool towards an end and think about the transformation of the public sphere, a huge issue will be the first digital divide. So the question, who has access? Who in the world has the material means to access the internet and to participate in digital worlds or in digital communication? If we understand digital media rather hermeneutically, in the sense of that it allows for a certain kind of information and constitution of content, we will ask for the second digital divide. That is not so much asking who has access, but that's asking how do people use the internet? Do people have the competence and the ability to use digital technology to their own goals and in their own need? Does digital technology help them to participate? So here the stress would be on competences and on abilities, on capabilities. And last but not least, the societal understanding of digital media will ask for the culture of connection. How does the transformation, the digital transformation, affect our culture of communicating in the public, our culture of communicating with people of other opinions or of one's own opinion? This is what comes into view if we understand digital media societal. And in all that, the goal and the aim of a critical public digital theology is to ask for that what allows meaningful participation. That was the example of digital public spheres. I now come to the next example of digital commons and digital science. And now we are not talking about the dimension of society anymore, but about the dimension of academic work and the issue how digital transformation affects academic practices. First, digital media changes the access to knowledge and scholarly communication, thereby changing the structural affordances of participation to the public sphere. Scholarly communities are becoming more permeable and at the same time have to compete with other providers for the attention of digital users. In the process, the importance of individuals or smaller groups for the aggregation of knowledge is increasing. Second, networked structures make epistemic communities primary carriers of knowledge and cognition, enabling participation more easily. Third, digital research often benefits from its collaboratively work and shared data and methods, as one can see in the digital humanities. These changes are embedded in the debate on open science, ranging from accessibility of research data, open data, of research methods, open methods, to the practice of unrestricted online publications, open publications. And we connect in our chapter all that with a plea for digital commons, for a more participatory design of theological discourse that is enabled by digital technology. And with that, we come to the third field. Frederike, I hand the word back to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, as you've seen, David Tracy suggested the three publics, the societal, the academic, and the church as a public for theology. So the third and last example we explored was the question of how could we understand the church to be a public within the digital. Under this lens, this critical lens on the question of how could the digital enable a more participatory form of being public within and in the church. And what we found in the debates on digital theology mostly was the image of the network, to understand church as a network, and understand that to be a way of being a more participatory church in something most scholars call the network society, following Manuel Castells. Imagining church as a network highlights three characteristics regarding to the question of participation. Firstly, it highlights that a network describes the informal connections of believers in, between, and among the organization, or maybe even completely detached from them. So it's not the organization, it's not the institution, but it's the informal connections people can build up from their own belief, from their own practices, religious and spiritual practices, to relate one to another. Secondly, the starting point for the description of the community is the individual believer, if you think about a network. And these communication networks are based on these believers rather than on institutions or organizations or even shared beliefs in the sense of dogma or confessions. Thus, it is initially a horizontal description of human communion as a community, as the media scientific and sociological origin of the image of the network suggested. The network, the image of the network is a description of community, so it is of no surprise that this is mirrored in the understanding we find in theology. And this structure is then interpreted theologically. The communities of digital churches see themselves as being communio in the theological sense, a communio in the Holy Spirit, a communio digitalis. And this is not like the first time I would argue, or we argued in the chapter, that we find these kind of ecclesiologies in something we would call public theology, but you can relate that to other forms of ecclesiology. For example, like Friedrich Schleiermacher started with individual believers and then building up like the communion of believers around that. But there's also a danger when it comes to participation and when you think about the understanding of church being a network, which would be a mere virtual ontology. So what we found in the literature is speaking about like the electronic temple, or the only like spiritual relation of people unto one another, is in danger to overlook the necessity and the realities of the concrete space and place and structures of the churches, even in the digital. And these structures enable participation, but sometimes also hinder it. And in the Lutheran tradition, we find this differentiation. I thought it very helpful in this regard, which is the difference between the communio and the congregatio. The congregatio is the community in the local congregation gathering on Sundays, and I think this might be helpful even to think about when we think about digital publics and digital churches. Who are the people who are really there? Who are the people who have access? Who are the people who really can participate? And who are we excluding by the ways we do church in the digital? So the question which I think, or the critical ones, if we think about digital public ecclesiology, would be to what extent is the image of constant connectivity and openness actually fulfilled in the networks we're living our faith in? Where church networks ostensibly open but still lead to exclusion through language, aesthetics, know-how, or something else, but also through the necessary technical infrastructure. And where does the image of the network hide asymmetric structures of power and exclusion pretending to be open and horizontally structured? So there's a lot of things to reflect upon in this first examples we draw at this intersection of public theology and digital theology, and I'm looking forward to maybe discuss some of them with you all now. Thank you for your attention. Looking forward to your questions and comments.